The California gold rush is often remembered as a success story. Gold was discovered, people arrived in enormous numbers, and a new economy formed almost overnight. For a brief moment, it appeared that opportunity was evenly distributed. Anyone could come, anyone could try, and many believed that effort alone would be enough. Most of them were wrong. Gold did exist in California, but it was not found by most of the people who went looking for it, and for the majority, the outcome fell far short of the promise. At the time, the logic seemed sound. According to contemporary accounts, early discoveries produced visible results. Gold could be collected with simple tools. Stories of quick success spread faster than accurate information. From a distance, the gold rush looked accessible. Text, but later records tell a different story. As more people arrived, returns declined sharply. Claims became crowded. Costs increased, and the number of miners who left with lasting wealth remained small. The California gold rush did not fail. It produced gold on a massive scale. What it failed to produce was equality of outcome. So how did one of the most famous gold discoveries in history leave so many people empty-handed? And why did the promise remain convincing even as the odds quietly disappeared? California did not initially appear extraordinary because of scale. It appeared extraordinary because of accessibility. Gold was discovered close to the surface. It could be collected from rivers, streams, and exposed ground. Early miners used simple tools, pans, shovels, wooden sluices. Text this mattered, unlike later mining booms that required capital or machinery. Early California gold seemed to reward presence rather than preparation. You did not need deep knowledge, expensive equipment, or institutional backing. According to contemporary reports, this created a powerful assumption. If gold could be found by accident, then effort alone might be enough to guarantee success. News traveled faster than context. Newspapers, letters, and personal stories emphasized discovery, not probability. They described visible gold, not the number of people who failed to find it. Losses were private. Success was public. Geography reinforced the illusion. California was distant, but reachable. The land appeared open. There were few formal barriers to entry. Claims could be made quickly. Text movement between locations was possible. Failure did not immediately end participation. This flexibility created momentum. People believed they could adjust strategy if conditions changed. If one river failed, another might succeed. If one claim was exhausted, another could be found. What was missing from this logic was scale. As arrival numbers increased, the very openness that had attracted people began to work against them. Surface deposits were limited. Riverbanks filled quickly. The easiest gold was claimed first and rarely replaced. By the time this became obvious, California had already absorbed hundreds of thousands of people. The gold rush continued to look accessible long after it stopped being fair. Text and that delay between appearance and reality would define the experience of most who took part. In the earliest phase of the California gold rush, timing mattered more than skill. Those who arrived first encountered conditions that would never repeat. Rivers were lightly worked. Riverbeds had not yet been turned over. Gold-bearing gravel lay undisturbed in places that required little more than patience to exploit. Early miners did not face competition in the modern sense. They faced uncertainty, but not saturation. According to contemporary accounts, Small groups could work the same area for weeks before returns declined. The gold was not evenly distributed, but it was available enough to sustain hope. This created the stories that fueled the rush. Text men returned east with modest but visible success. Gold dust was shown, weighed, and circulated as proof. What was not shown were the thousands who found nothing and quietly moved on. As arrivals accelerated, conditions changed rapidly. Riverbanks filled, claims overlapped, access narrowed. What had once been an open landscape became segmented into small, heavily contested areas. Late arrivals often found themselves working ground that had already been disturbed, sometimes multiple times. The difference between arriving in 1848 and arriving in 1849 was profound. By 1850, it was decisive. Timing did not just affect opportunity, it shaped perception. Those who arrived early often believed their success was the result of effort or judgment. Text those who arrived later were told the same logic still applied, even as evidence suggested otherwise. This mismatch created persistence. Late arrivals did not immediately abandon hope. They assumed their moment simply had not arrived yet. They stayed longer, invested more, and delayed exit decisions. By the time many accepted that timing had worked against them, the cost of leaving had increased. Travel home was expensive. Supplies were already purchased. Time had already been spent. California did not close its doors. It simply narrowed them, and most people arrived after that narrowing had already begun. As the gold rush progressed, effort gradually lost its predictive power. Early success had created a simple equation: work harder, right arrow, find more gold. For a short time, that equation held. Text, but as surface deposits disappeared, mining changed in ways most people did not anticipate. Riverbeds were reworked again and again. Gold-bearing gravel became harder to identify. Returns grew inconsistent. According to historical records, miners began spending more time processing material that produced less gold than before. Days of labor yielded only trace amounts. Weeks passed without meaningful finds. This shift did not happen uniformly. A small number of claims continued to produce results. These exceptions reinforced the belief that persistence would eventually pay off. But statistically, the pattern had already changed. The average miner now worked longer for less. Costs rose quietly. Food, tools, and basic supplies became more expensive as demand increased. Text simple living required steady income, something mining no longer guaranteed. What made this phase especially difficult was ambiguity. The gold rush did not collapse. It continued to produce visible success stories. Those stories mattered. They suggested that failure was personal rather than structural, that those who had not yet succeeded simply needed to adjust their method or location. This interpretation kept people working claims that no longer made economic sense. Miners moved frequently, chasing reports of new discoveries. Each move reset expectations without resetting conditions. Effort remained high. Returns did not. The result was a growing gap between what people put in and what they took out. Text by the time many recognized that effort alone was no longer enough. They were already deeply invested, financially, physically, and psychologically. The gold rush had not ended, but the rules that governed it had changed, and most participants were slow to realize it. As mining returns declined for most individuals, it became clear that gold was still generating wealth, just not evenly. The gold rush did not stop being profitable. It changed who it was profitable for. According to historical records, merchants, transport operators, and landowners often fared better than miners themselves. They sold certainty in an environment defined by risk. Food, tools, clothing, and lodging were needed regardless of whether gold was found. Text prices rose quickly, reflecting scarcity, distance, and demand. For miners, these costs were unavoidable. For suppliers, they were an opportunity. Some businesses operated on thin margins, but constant volume. Others controlled key choke points, river crossings, ports, supply routes, and extracted steady income from movement itself. This created a parallel economy. Gold flowed sporadically from the ground. Money flowed consistently through commerce. Those who arrived early enough to secure land or infrastructure benefited disproportionately. Property near active mining areas appreciated rapidly. Rent increased as competition intensified. Investors from outside California also played a role. They financed operations, equipment, and transportation, often without setting foot in the mining regions. Returns, when they came, moved outward, away from the camps and toward established financial centers. For many miners, this created a quiet reversal. They had come seeking gold. Instead, they became customers in a system designed to profit from their persistence. The longer they stayed, the more value they transferred, not upward through success, but outward through necessity. The gold rush did not concentrate wealth in miners' hands. It redistributed it toward those who controlled access, supply, and timing. And that redistribution was far more predictable than gold itself. As surface gold became scarce, mining in California began to change structurally. What had once been an individual pursuit slowly turned into an organized process. Early miners worked alone or in small groups. They chose locations freely and moved often. Decisions were personal and reversible. This flexibility disappeared as conditions tightened. According to historical accounts, deeper deposits required coordination. Water had to be redirected. Gravel had to be moved in large quantities. Simple tools were no longer sufficient. Techniques such as hydraulic mining and large sluice systems emerged to compensate for declining surface returns. These methods increased output, but they also increased barriers to entry. Mining now required capital. Equipment was expensive. Operations had to be planned and maintained. Risk shifted from physical endurance to financial exposure. Independent miners faced a choice. They could join larger operations as laborers. They could pool resources and accept shared control, or they could leave. Many chose to stay, but not on their original terms. Working for wages inside someone else's operation was fundamentally different from prospecting. Effort no longer translated into ownership. Success was measured in continuity, not discovery. This transition happened gradually, which made it difficult to resist. There was no official end to independent mining. There was simply less space for it to succeed. As larger operations expanded, they reshaped the landscape itself. Rivers were redirected. Hillsides were stripped. Entire areas became unworkable for small-scale miners. The environment began to reflect the new structure. Mining was no longer about finding gold. It was about processing ground efficiently. For those who had arrived believing in personal opportunity, this shift was decisive. The gold rush still produced gold, but it no longer produced independence. And for many, that was the moment when staying stopped making sense, even if leaving was still difficult. One of the least discussed aspects of the California gold rush was how difficult it became to leave. At the beginning, participation felt temporary. People spoke of trying their luck and returning home if things did not work out. Failure was imagined as reversible. Reality unfolded differently. By the time many miners realized their chances had narrowed, they were already embedded in the system the gold rush had created. Text travel to California was expensive and dangerous. Returning required resources that many no longer had. Money spent getting there could not be recovered. According to contemporary letters and personal accounts, this created a psychological trap. Leaving meant accepting loss, not just of money, but of time, identity, and expectation. Staying allowed hope to remain intact, even if it was no longer realistic. The gold rush did not force people to remain. It made departure emotionally and practically costly. Social dynamics reinforced this pattern. Mining camps were built on shared optimism. Stories of success circulated constantly, even when they represented rare outcomes. Failure was individualized and often hidden. Those who left quietly disappeared from the narrative. Those who stayed continued to contribute to it. This created a distorted sense of probability. Miners did not compare themselves to the majority who failed. They compared themselves to the few who succeeded. As a result, many adjusted expectations downward instead of exiting entirely. They stopped aiming for wealth. They aimed to break even, then to avoid falling further behind. The longer they stayed, the harder it became to justify leaving. Time invested became a reason to invest more. Effort already spent became an argument for continued effort. The gold rush thrived on this logic. It did not need to deceive people outright. It only needed to delay clarity. And for many participants, that delay lasted until there was little left to return to. As mining intensified, the California gold rush began to leave permanent marks, not just on people, but on the land itself. Early mining had been relatively limited in scale. River panning and shallow digging altered small areas and could be abandoned without lasting consequence. This changed as gold became harder to find. Larger operations reshaped entire regions. Rivers were diverted. Hillsides were stripped down to bedrock. Valleys were filled with waste material. According to historical records, hydraulic mining in particular transformed vast areas of California. High-pressure water cannons were used to break down hillsides, releasing gold trapped in sediment. The technique was effective. It was also destructive. Downstream farms were flooded with debris. Waterways became clogged. Land that had supported agriculture became unusable. This environmental cost rarely factored into individual decision-making at the time. For miners, immediate survival mattered more than long-term impact. For companies, efficiency mattered more than sustainability. The gold rush economy rewarded extraction, not preservation. Over time, conflicts emerged between miners and other residents. Farmers, towns, and downstream communities bore the consequences of upstream activity. Legal challenges eventually followed. Court decisions in the late 19th century restricted hydraulic mining, recognizing the scale of damage it caused. By then, the landscape had already been permanently altered. The physical scars of the gold rush mirrored its human outcomes. Large gains were concentrated. Text costs were widely distributed, and repair came too late to benefit most of those involved. California's gold did not simply disappear. It was extracted alongside something else, stability. And once both were gone, the land itself became a record of what the rush had required. When the California gold rush ended, it did not conclude with a clear verdict. There was no official reckoning, no summary of winners and losers, no moment when the scale of failure became obvious. Instead, history absorbed the event unevenly. Textbooks and popular accounts emphasized discovery, growth, and expansion. They highlighted the cities that survived, the industries that formed, and the wealth that circulated through the economy. What they rarely emphasized was proportion. Text according to later historical analysis, only a small fraction of those who arrived during the gold rush left with meaningful wealth. The majority earned little or nothing beyond subsistence. Many left worse off than when they arrived. These outcomes were not dramatic enough to dominate the narrative. Failure was scattered across thousands of individual experiences. Success was concentrated and visible. As a result, the gold rush became remembered as a collective achievement rather than a collective gamble. California benefited institutionally. Infrastructure expanded. Trade routes stabilized. Cities like San Francisco grew into permanent economic centers. But these gains did not belong equally to those who had chased gold. Text for many miners, their contribution to this transformation went unrecognized. They provided labor, demand, and risk. The long-term benefits accrued elsewhere. In this way, the gold rush succeeded as a historical process even as it failed most participants. It created a state, an economy, and a myth, but it did not deliver what the myth implied. History preserved the outcome, memory preserved the promise, and the distance between the two continued to widen long after the gold was gone. For most people who took part in the California gold rush, the end did not arrive with a clear decision. It arrived gradually. Mining slowed. Claims were abandoned quietly. People moved on without ceremony. Many former miners did not return home immediately. Text they stayed in California, working as laborers, farmers, craftsmen, or clerks. Others drifted toward new frontiers, repeating the same pattern elsewhere. According to census records and personal accounts, the gold rush reshaped lives even when it did not produce wealth. Careers were delayed. Savings were depleted. Health was often compromised by years of physical labor and unstable living conditions. The opportunity cost was significant. Time spent chasing gold was time not spent building skills, businesses, or stable livelihoods elsewhere. For younger participants, this lost time could not be recovered. For older ones, it narrowed remaining options. Families were affected as well. Extended absences strained relationships. Text some miners returned home changed, financially poorer and psychologically hardened. Others never returned at all. Yet the gold rush continued to influence decisions long after it ended. Those who had participated often carried a lingering belief that success was still possible somewhere else. That the failure had been circumstantial rather than structural, that the next attempt might finally align effort with reward. This mindset shaped later migrations and economic risks across the American West. The gold rush did not simply redistribute people geographically. It normalized a way of thinking, one where uncertainty was tolerated and delayed clarity was accepted as the price of opportunity. For institutions, this mindset proved useful. For individuals, it proved costly. Text: the long-term consequence was not poverty on a massive scale. It was instability, spread quietly across thousands of lives. And instability, unlike failure, rarely receives historical attention. The California Gold Rush is remembered because it changed everything around it. It reshaped California. It accelerated migration. It helped define how opportunity would be imagined in the American West. What it did not do was reward most of the people who believed in it. Gold existed in California. It was extracted in enormous quantities, but it was never distributed in a way that matched the scale of participation. For the majority, the gold rush was not our path to wealth. It was an encounter with probability, misunderstood, delayed, and quietly unforgiving. Text: people came believing effort would be enough. They stayed believing persistence would correct early failure. They left when neither proved true. The rush succeeded as a system. It concentrated resources. It built infrastructure. It transferred wealth toward those positioned to absorb risk rather than bear it. But as a promise to individuals, it failed far more often than it worked. That contradiction is why the story endures. The California Gold Rush was not our lie. It was something more subtle. It was an event where the outcome was real, the opportunity was visible, and the odds were never evenly shared. Gold shaped the land, the economy, and the future. But for most who chased it, the lasting impact was not what they gained. It was what they learned too late. Text: that effort does not always scale, that timing matters more than belief, and that some systems grow precisely because they convince many to stay long after success has narrowed. The gold was real, but it was never meant for most of the people who went looking for it.